In our lesson for September the 27th, we'll be looking at Genesis chapter 6, and we're going to expand on what we talked about in last week's lesson. Remember that God created human beings for fellowship with Him and gave to human beings a responsibility. We were to take care of the earth and we were to live in obedience to Him. And as long as we did that, God provided the perfect environment. But of course, the story doesn't end so well. We've already looked at this in previous lessons. Instead of obeying God, mankind disobeyed God, and therefore, instead of enjoying fellowship with God, we suffered the consequences of our sin. We looked at those personal consequences last week, the consequences of guilt, the consequences of a lost sense of purpose, consequences of woman's relationship with man distorted by this fall of humanity. Adam, as a man, the pain and labor of his work, all of these things were the personal consequences of the sin. But now the picture has expanded. And it's not just Adam and Eve responsible before God in paying the consequences. Now it seems that all of humankind has fallen into this, and it leads into what is known in history as the flood. The flood, of course, is an instrument of God's judgment on humanity. So let's begin by looking, chapter 6, verses 5 through 18, at the reason for the flood. Why did God send the flood? A little girl in Sunday school answered the question like this. She said there were a whole lot of dirty people that needed to be cleaned up. Well, that's a pretty good description of what Genesis chapter 6 says. Because of the disobedience of man, it spread. And look at the statement in verse number 5. It said, "The Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time." That's a powerful statement. Every inclination all the time was evil. So why did the flood come? The flood came because of the sinfulness of humanity. That's the first reason. But from God's perspective, we can state it in a slightly different way and say that the flood came not just because of the wickedness of humanity, but the flood came because of God's broken heart. Look at verse 6. The biblical writer says that the Lord was grieved that He had made man on the earth. Still in verse 6, His heart was filled with pain. Still in verse 7, He says, "I am grieved that I had made man." And what does that mean? It's not, the biblical writer is not giving us a picture of God's vacillation as if, oh, I made this decision and I made the wrong decision, now I'm going to do this. It really is more a reflection of God's heart. It's kind of a breathing out of His disappointment with humanity. He created us in His image, gave us the capacity for a relationship with Him, put us in a perfect environment, made only one requirement of us, and that is that we would obey Him. And human beings, nevertheless, tossed all of that out and sinned against